The dog would draw blood twice before anyone understood what it was actually afraid of, and the man who finally calmed it down owned nothing but a duffel bag and a folding knife. Nobody at the gate that night believed a homeless man in a stained field jacket could walk up to 70 pounds of trained muscle and rage and make it lie down in the grass like a puppy. But nobody at that gate had ever served with a dog like that either. This is the story of how a Malinois named Ghost and a discarded EOD technician named Eli Marsh found each other on the worst night of both their lives, and how what happened after changed a lot more than either of them expected. Eli Marsh had been sleeping under the Selman Expressway overpass for 11 weeks when the temperature dropped into the low 40s, and his knee started aching in that particular way that meant rain was coming, even though the Tampa sky was clear and hard and full of stars. He had learned to read weather in his joints the way some men read barometers, a habit picked up somewhere between Kandahar and a VA waiting room, and it was one of the few skills from his old life that still worked exactly the way it was supposed to. He was 34 years old. He looked 50 in bad light and about 100 in good light, which was one of the crueler jokes the last 4 years had played on him. He kept his gear the way he'd been trained to keep it, which was the one part of himself the last 4 years hadn't managed to take. His sleeping bag was rolled tight and lashed with paracord at the head and foot. His boots, laces double-knotted, sat lined up against the concrete, piling 6 inches from where his head would rest, toes pointed toward the exit, the way you learn to stage your boots when you might have to move fast in the dark. He had a plastic tote with a lid that snapped, and inside it were the things that still mattered. A photograph of his unit at Bagram with half their faces sunburned and grinning, a folded and refolded letter from his ex-wife that he no longer read but couldn't throw away, a pill bottle with 3 tablets left in it that he was rationing like ammunition, and his DD-214, laminated now, the plastic starting to yellow and peel at the corners like old skin. The shrapnel was still in his left hip, 4 small fragments the surgeons at Landstuhl decided weren't worth the risk of digging out, close enough to nerve tissue that removing them might do more damage than leaving them. On cold nights his hip announced itself the way a check engine light does, a low, insistent throb that never quite became unbearable, but never let him forget it either. That was the visible wound, the one you could point to on an X-ray. The other one didn't show up on film. That one lived behind his sternum and in the wiring of his inner ear, and it woke him at 2 and 3 and 4 in the morning convinced, for 4 or 5 seconds every single time, that the sound of a truck backfiring on Nebraska Avenue was a pressure wave rolling toward him across sand. He'd been an explosive ordnance disposal technician, 8 years, 2 deployments, the second one cut short at month 7, when a device he'd already cleared once detonated on a second pass. A mistake that wasn't his mistake. An intelligence failure too links up the chain that nobody above the rank of major ever had to answer for. He remembered heat and a color that wasn't a color, more like the inside of his own eyelids turned inside out, and then he remembered a medic's face very close to his, saying his name over and over like it was the only word the man knew. He kept his hearing. He kept his hip, mostly. He came home with a purple heart, a chest full of ribbons nobody in Tampa ever asked him to explain, and a claims packet that the Department of Veterans Affairs would spend the next 3 years losing, requesting again, losing again, and eventually denying on a technicality involving which specific incident report matched which specific date of injury. A discrepancy of 6 days between 2 documents, filed by 2 different units, in a war zone where paperwork was not always anyone's first priority. He'd had a marriage before all that, a decent one, to a woman named Carla who worked in dental billing and used to leave sticky notes on the bathroom mirror with little jokes on them. He'd had a house with a 2-car garage in Brandon, a green Honda Civic with a bad transmission, and a daughter who was 4 years old the last time he saw her sleeping in her booster seat, her small chin tucked against her chest, dead to the world in the way only children and the truly innocent can be. He didn't blame Carla for leaving. He told himself that so many times it had started to feel almost true. A man who couldn't sleep in the same room as his wife because her breathing pattern sometimes matched a rhythm his brain associated with counting down to something bad. That man was hard to stay married to, and he understood that in the same clinical, distant way he understood most things about his own condition, the way you'd read a bulletin about someone else's diagnosis. Bureaucratic betrayal, if you wanted to call it that, and Eli mostly didn't, because it felt too dramatic a term for the flat gray reality of it, was a letter. Just a letter, 3 paragraphs, government seal at the top, informing him his disability rating had been adjusted downward from 60% to 10% following a reevaluation exam conducted by a contracted physician who had spent 11 minutes with him and never once asked about his hip. 10%. Enough mathematically to disqualify him from the housing assistance program he'd been approved for 2 months earlier, not enough to live on, arriving 3 weeks after his unemployment ran out and 5 days before his landlord changed the locks on the studio apartment in Ybor City he could no longer make rent on. He had appealed. The appeal was, as of that week in late November, still pending, a word that had stopped meaning anything to him except a kind of silence that got returned to sender. So he lived under the overpass with 4 other men, an informal little society with its own unspoken rules, its own hierarchy, its own night watch schedule that nobody had ever voted on but that everybody somehow obeyed. He ate what the church on Nebraska Avenue put out on Tuesdays and Fridays, supplemented by whatever he could find or earn doing day labor when a contractor's truck rolled slow enough along the frontage road for men to flag it down. He was down to maybe 160 pounds on a frame built for 190, and his cheeks had that hollowed look that made strangers cross the street, not out of cruelty exactly, just out of the particular fear people have of things that remind them how thin the ice really is under everybody's life. He did not think of himself as broken. This was important, and it was the thing that separated Eli Marsh from a certain kind of story people liked to tell about men in his position. He did not sit under that overpass feeling sorry for himself in any dramatic way. He had simply methodically been ground down by a series of ordinary failures, a missing form here, a 6-day discrepancy there, a marriage that couldn't survive a war that followed him home, until the machinery of his life had stopped running, the way an engine stops when enough small parts fail at once, none of them individually catastrophic. He still shaved twice a week using the sink in the gas station bathroom on Kennedy, because Master Sergeant Halloway used to say a man who let his grooming go was halfway to letting everything else go too, and some habits outlive the reasons for them. He still stood a little too straight. He still, when a car backfired, caught himself counting under his breath before he could stop it, 1,000, 1,000, an old habit for judging distance to a blast that his body had never gotten the message the war was over. That was where he was the 3rd week of November when he met the dog. It happened on a Tuesday, around 6 in the evening, the light already gone soft and orange and low the way it does in a Florida winter, the kind of light that makes even a highway underpass look almost forgivable. Eli was walking back from the church with a paper sack of sandwiches under one arm, cutting through the alley behind a row of dumpsters on his way to the overpass, when he heard something that wasn't quite a bark and wasn't quite a whine, a low, continuous sound like a kettle just before it screams, coming from behind a chain-link fence that bordered a construction site. He almost kept walking. That was the truth of it, and it was a truth he'd think about later more than once. A year earlier in his old life, he might have stopped out of simple curiosity, but a man living the way he was living learns to conserve his attention the same way he conserves calories, because attention costs something too, and getting involved in things that aren't your business is a luxury for people with a roof over their heads. He almost kept walking. But the sound had a shape to it he recognized, some old wiring in his brainstem lighting up before his conscious mind caught up, and he stopped, and he looked, and he saw the dog. It was wedged into the gap between a dumpster and the fence, in a space barely wide enough for its own body, and it was shaking so hard the chain link was rattling faintly where its haunch pressed against it. Some kind of Belgian Malinois, or mostly Malinois, lean and long-legged under a coat, matted with what looked like motor oil and old blood gone brown and crusted. One ear stood up sharp and alert in a way that looked almost military in its precision. The other ear was torn nearly in half, healed wrong, folded over like a page someone had dog-eared and never smoothed flat. Its left eye had a pale cloudy film across it, cataract or scar tissue, Eli couldn't tell which in that light, and around its neck, buried in fur so matted it took Eli a moment to find it at all, was a chewed and faded nylon collar with no tags. The dog was staring at him, not growling, not baring teeth, just staring, its whole body locked rigid, breath coming fast and shallow, in a posture Eli recognized on some instinctive level before his conscious mind put a name to it, because he had seen that exact posture before, on men, on himself, in mirrors he'd rather not have looked into. It was the posture of something waiting to find out whether the next thing that happened to it was going to be bad. "Hey," Eli said, low, not moving closer. "Hey now." The dog's lip curled back a half-inch, showing the edge of a canine tooth, a warning issued more out of habit than actual threat, the kind of warning a tired animal gives because giving it costs less than finding out it wasn't necessary. "Yeah, I hear you," Eli said. "I'm not real thrilled to be here either." He crouched down, slow, joints protesting, keeping his hands visible and low, the way you'd approach anything you didn't fully trust and didn't want to startle, whether it was a dog or a device buried under a road. He didn't reach for it. He'd learned enough somewhere in his life, mostly from an old team dog handler named Ray's who used to talk about his Malinois the way other men talked about their kids, to know that reaching for a frightened animal too fast was the surest way to get bitten and to make everything worse for both of you. I got a sandwich, he said, unwrapping half of a turkey and cheese from the paper sack with hands that had gone stiff and cold. Church made these. Not great, honestly. Little dry, but it's food. He tore off a piece and set it on the ground, not throwing it, just placing it a few feet away, and then he sat back on his heels and waited, because waiting was another thing the last several years had taught him he was good at, whether he wanted to be or not. The dog did not move for a long time, long enough that Eli's knees went from stiff to genuinely painful, long enough that the orange light drained fully out of the sky, and the street lamp at the end of the alley buzzed on with a sound like a trapped insect. But eventually, inch by inch, the dog crept forward, belly low to the ground, ears flat, and took the piece of bread and meat in one fast snap and retreated immediately back into the gap by the fence, chewing with a wariness that suggested it expected the food to be followed by a boot. "See," Eli said quietly, "nobody's going to hit you. Not tonight anyway. Can't speak for every night of your life. Looks like somebody already covered that part." He fed it the rest of the sandwich in small pieces over the next 20 minutes, and by the time it was fully dark he had managed, through nothing more than patience and the particular stillness a man learns from years of standing over live ordnance, to get within 3 feet of the animal without it bolting. He didn't touch it. He told himself he wasn't going to get attached to a half-feral dog with a torn ear and a bad eye when he could barely feed himself, and he told himself this with the particular firmness of a man who already suspects he's lying to himself and is going to do the thing anyway. "All right," he said, standing, his knees cracking loud enough that the dog flinched. "I'll come back tomorrow, same time. Don't go dying on me tonight, that's all I ask." He came back the next evening, and the one after that. It took 11 days before the dog would take food from his open palm instead of off the ground, and it took 16 before it would let him rest 2 fingers briefly against the top of its head, and even then it flinched at the contact like the touch itself might be a trick. "You got a name?" Eli asked it, one of those first nights, more to hear a human voice than out of any real expectation of an answer. "Didn't figure. Well, you look like somebody I used to know. Quiet, doesn't trust much of anything. I'm gonna call you Ghost if that's all right with you, on account of you appearing out of nowhere and looking like you seen some things." The dog predictably said nothing, but its ear, the good one, the sharp one, twitched toward him at the sound of the name, and something about that small motion settled into Eli's chest like a key turning in a lock he'd forgotten he had. It was the 5th of December, on a night cold enough that Eli's breath fogged in front of him, when he noticed the tattoo. He was checking the dog over the way you'd check a piece of equipment for damage, an instinct from a life where you learn to inventory everything, hands moving carefully along a foreleg the dog had been favoring, when he pushed back the matted fur along the inside of the ear, the torn one, and saw, faint but unmistakable under a layer of grime, a series of small green numbers and letters tattooed into the pink skin. He sat back on his heels in the cold alley and stared at it for a long moment. He knew what that was. Any man who'd spent time around military working dogs knew what that was. It wasn't a shelter tattoo, and it wasn't a breeder's mark. It was a service tattoo, the kind stamped into a dog the way a serial number gets stamped into a rifle, and it meant that somewhere in some database, this animal had a file with its name on it. "Well, I'll be damned," Eli murmured, and for the first time in longer than he could remember, something that wasn't dread moved through his chest. He didn't have a phone of his own. The last one had been shut off for non-payment back in September, but the shelter on Nebraska ran a phone bank in the evenings for men trying to sort out benefits paperwork, and it took him 2 days of waiting in line before he got 15 minutes at a scarred plastic desk with a rotary-style handset that still somehow worked. He called a number he hadn't dialed in 6 years, a number he still had memorized the way you memorize the birthdays of people you love, and on the 4th ring a voice he recognized instantly picked up. "Rays," the voice said. "Sergeant Rays, it's Eli Marsh." There was a pause on the line, the particular pause of a man doing quick math on how long it's been, and then Rays let out a short laugh that had real warmth in it. "Marsh, you son of a gun, I heard you got out. Heard some other stuff too, that wasn't so good to hear." "Yeah, some of it's true." Eli didn't elaborate, and Rays, to his credit, didn't push. "Listen, I need a favor. You still got contacts in the K9 program, records access, anything like that?" "Some, what have you got?" Eli read him the string of characters off the inside of the dog's ear, letter by letter, careful, the way you'd read off coordinates that mattered. He heard Ray's exhale slow on the other end. "Give me a day," Ray said. "Maybe two." It took Ray's 4 days, and when he called back, the shelter let Eli give out their line for callbacks, a small mercy Eli hadn't expected and wouldn't forget. His voice had lost some of its earlier warmth and picked up something closer to reverence. "Eli, you need to sit down for this one. I'm sitting on a milk crate in an alley. Ray's, go ahead." That dog's name is Karma, registered working dog, contracted through a private security and detection firm out of Jacksonville. Before that, she ran 2 rotations attached to a Marine EOD unit outside Helmand, 09 through 11. Explosive detection, specialized in vehicle-borne devices. Her files got a commendation in it for a find outside Sangin that her handler's report says saved an entire convoy, 13 vehicles. Eli sat very still, the phone pressed hard against his ear, watching ghost Karma through the shelter's front window, where she lay curled in a corner of the alley he could just barely see from the desk, watching him back with that one clear eye and one clouded one. "What happened to her?" he asked. "Why's she living behind a dumpster in Ybor City instead of retired somewhere with a family?" Handler rotated home in 11, medical discharge, and Karma got reassigned instead of retired because the contract firm that owned her paperwork wanted to keep billing for an asset. She bounced between 3 different private contractors over the next few years doing detection work at ports and depots, and then the trail on her goes cold around 2018. No retirement paperwork filed anywhere I can find. No adoption record. Firm that had her last name of Coastal Sentry Solutions dissolved and got bought out. My guess, and it's only a guess, is somebody just stopped accounting for her. Cut a corner. Dogs get lost in that gap sometimes, same as people do. Eli looked back out the window at Karma, who had gone still and alert the second his voice changed, ears up, watching him the way she watched everything now, waiting to see what kind of day this was going to turn out to be. "She's not lost anymore," Eli said. He didn't know that night how true that sentence was going to turn out to be, or how much weight it was going to end up carrying. But he said it anyway, and he meant it, and it was maybe the first fully true thing he'd said out loud to another person in over a year. The weeks that followed were the slowest, and in a strange way Eli didn't examine too closely, some of the best weeks he'd had in a long time. He and Karma developed a rhythm that had nothing dramatic about it and everything necessary. He'd wake before dawn, check his boots, check hers, a habit he started once he noticed her pads were cracked and bleeding in 2 places, and he began wrapping them each morning in strips of an old t-shirt until he could scrounge actual dog boots from a donation bin behind the shelter. He'd walk her along the frontage road while the light came up gray and then gold, and she'd fall into step at his left heel without ever being taught to, the way a well-trained dog does when. The training never fully leaves the body, even after the mind has been broken by neglect. He learned her tells the way he used to learn the tells of a device before he touched it. She had a particular sound she made that wasn't quite a growl and wasn't quite a whine, a low rolling sound in the back of her throat, almost like a purr gone wrong, that she made exactly twice, once when she was deeply content, lying with her head across his boot in the gray hour before sunrise, and once when something in the environment had set off an alarm bell in her head that she couldn't yet justify barking about. It took Eli almost 3 weeks to learn to tell the two apart by pitch alone, and once he did, he trusted that sound the way he used to trust the read on a detector. The bonding wasn't smooth. There were nights she wouldn't let him near her at all, curling into the farthest corner of whatever shelter they'd found, her breathing gone ragged and fast in a way Eli recognized, because his own breathing did the same thing on his worst nights. The first time he saw her have what he came to think of as an episode, triggered, he eventually figured out, by the specific sound of a diesel engine idling, a sound close enough to a generator or a vehicle convoy to flip some old switch in her. She went rigid and then began turning in tight, frantic circles, snapping at her own flank, whining in a high continuous register that broke something in his chest to hear. He didn't grab her. He'd learned enough by then not to grab her. He sat down on the pavement a few feet away, made himself as low and unthreatening as a grown man could manage, and started talking, low and even, the way he'd once talked to himself in the dark after his own bad nights, an old trick a VA counselor had taught him that he'd never once used until this exact moment. "You're okay," he said. "You're not there. You're here with me. It's December. It's Tampa. There's no convoy. There's no road. You're safe." He kept his voice at the same flat, steady pitch over and over, the words themselves mattering less than the rhythm of them, and slowly, over 4 or 5 minutes that felt considerably longer, her circling slowed and her breathing evened, and she came and pressed her whole trembling weight against his side and stayed there until the shaking stopped. "There it is," he murmured, one hand resting light on her back, not gripping, just present. There it is. I got you. Same trick works on me too, Somebody had to teach it to me first. He found in the weeks after that the mirror ran both directions. On the nights his own hip flared bad enough to keep him from sleeping, or the nights a car alarm 2 blocks over sent his mind somewhere he didn't want it to go, Karma would wake and press herself against his back or his chest, not performing any trained behavior, just an animal responding to the tension in another body, the way animals often do better than people manage to. There was a comfort in it that Eli hadn't let himself feel in years, the simple animal comfort of not being alone in the dark with the worst parts of his own mind. He cleaned a wound on her hind leg the second week of December, a deep scrape gone half-infected, using hydrogen peroxide he bought with day labor money and gauze donated by the shelter nurse who'd started, without ever quite saying so out loud, keeping a small stash of supplies aside for Eli's dog. Karma stood rigid through the whole procedure, teeth gritted, that low rolling sound coming from her throat the entire time, but she didn't snap, didn't pull away, just stood and endured it and watched his face the whole time with an intensity that felt, to Eli, uncomfortably close to trust. You did this for real ones, he told her, dabbing carefully at the wound, way worse than this probably, and nobody was there afterward to tell you it's over. So I'm gonna say it now, it's over, this part's over. By late December, they had a routine solid enough that the other men under the overpass had started calling Eli, the dog guy, not unkindly, and one of them, an older vet named Prout who'd done 2 tours in a different war than Eli's, told him one night over a shared thermos of coffee, "That dog's the best thing that's happened to you since you got here, and don't think I haven't noticed you're sleeping better." "I'm sleeping the same," Eli said, which was a lie, and Prout, who'd clearly heard 1,000 veterans lie about their sleep, just laughed and let it go. It was the second week of January when everything changed, and it changed in a way that had nothing to do with the alley or the overpass or anything Eli had been expecting. He'd taken to walking Karma along Bayshore Boulevard in the early mornings, partly because the wide sidewalk and open water view seemed to settle her, and partly because it was the one stretch of the city where a homeless man and his dog could walk for an hour without anyone calling the police. Out of nervousness, on a gray, damp morning in the second week of January, cutting a block inland to avoid a construction crew blocking the sidewalk, they passed the wrought iron perimeter fence of a large waterfront property on Davis Islands, a house Eli had walked by a dozen times without really looking at it, a modern glass and stone place with a lawn so flawless it looked almost artificial. There was a dog behind that fence, a big one, some kind of cane corso or presa mix judging by the block head and the deep chest, pacing the inside of the property line with an agitation that seemed disproportionate to 2 men simply walking past on a public sidewalk. It threw itself at the fence hard enough to rattle the iron, snarling, and Karma, beside Eli, went instantly rigid, her hackles rising in a straight line down her spine, that low rolling sound starting deep in her throat, but not the content version of it, the other one. "Easy," Eli said, hand dropping to rest against her shoulder. "Easy, it's just a fence between us, that dog's not coming anywhere." But Karma didn't relax. She stared past the fence, past the pacing cane corso, up toward the house itself, ears locked forward, body coiled, and made a sound Eli had never heard from her before, something between a growl and an alert bark, sharp and short, 3 times, and then she sat. Sat square and still, staring at the house, the exact posture, Eli realized with a chill that had nothing to do with the January morning air, the exact posture a detection dog assumes when it's found something and is waiting for its handler to acknowledge the find. "What is it?" Eli said quietly, crouching beside her, following her sightline toward the house. "What do you see?" He didn't get an answer that morning, not the kind you could act on anyway. Just a big house on Davis Islands, an agitated guard dog behind a fence, and his own dog sitting in perfect silent alert on a public sidewalk, staring at a building like she was waiting for someone to clear it. He'd find out what she'd been reacting to 11 days later, and by then, it would already have started going very wrong for the man who owned that house. The man who owned the house was named Marcus Whitfield, 58 years old, founder and majority shareholder of a mid-sized logistics and freight brokerage headquartered in downtown Tampa, a company called Gulfline Transit that moved shipping containers between the port and inland distribution centers across 3 states. Whitfield had built the company from a single leased truck in 1994 into a business worth, by most estimates, somewhere north of $200 million, and he had, in the way of certain self-made men, developed a genuine and somewhat obsessive concern about the security of everything he'd built. He kept the guard dog, an 85-pound cane corso named Bruno, primarily for the house, and he paid a private security firm a substantial monthly retainer for perimeter monitoring, alarm response, and executive protection whenever he traveled. Bruno had been a problem for about 3 months. Whitfield's household staff, a housekeeper, a groundskeeper, and a rotating night security guard, had all separately reported that the dog's temperament had shifted, that he'd become unpredictable, snapping without clear provocation, refusing food some days and gorging on it others, pacing the property at night in a way that kept the whole household on edge. Whitfield had hired and fired 2 different trainers in that span, both of whom had quit after Bruno bit one of them badly enough to require stitches. The working theory, repeated by everyone from the vet to the trainers to Whitfield's wife, was simply that Bruno was becoming aggressive with age, a large breed guard dog reverting to some baseline instinct nobody could fully control. Nobody in that house had considered, because nobody had reason to, that Bruno's escalating agitation had started almost exactly 3 months earlier, which was also, though nobody connected the 2 facts at the time, almost exactly when Marcus Whitfield's chief financial officer, a sharp, soft-spoken man named Gerald Voss who had been with Gulfline Transit for 11 years, had begun making regular late-night visits to the house to review the books in Whitfield's home office. Visits that always seemed to coincide, if anyone had been keeping track, with Bruno's worst episodes. Eli didn't know any of this yet, of course, walking past that fence with Karma on a gray January morning. He only knew that his dog had reacted to something in that house, the way a trained detection animal reacts to a signature it's been taught to recognize, and that the reaction had unsettled him enough that he found himself, almost without deciding to, walking that same stretch of sidewalk again 3 mornings later, and then again until it had become an unspoken part of their routine, the same way checking his boots each morning was part of the row. Routine, an old habit of watching a location that felt like it mattered, even when he couldn't articulate why. The incident that put Eli's name in a police report happened on the night of January the 19th, a Monday, cold for Florida, low 50s, with a wind coming off the bay that cut through Eli's field jacket in a way that made his hip ache fiercely. He and Karma were walking later than usual, past 10 at night, because the shelter's evening meal had run long and Eli liked to let her have one final walk before settling in for the night, when he heard from the direction of the Whitfield property 2 blocks over a sound that stopped him cold. A man screaming high and raw with genuine terror, followed by the unmistakable frenzied snarling of a large dog in a full attack, and underneath it, the sound of someone being dragged. Karma was already moving before Eli fully processed the sound, straining hard against the leash, not toward it in panic, but toward it with the intent, focused urgency of a working dog moving to a task. And Eli, against every ounce of self-preservation 11 weeks of homelessness had taught him, let her pull him toward the noise instead of away from it. What they found when they rounded the corner onto the Whitfield property's side gate, which stood open, was chaos. A security guard, young, maybe 25, in a private firm's uniform, lay on the flagstone path with his forearm raised defensively above his face, blood soaking through his sleeve, while Bruno stood over him in a posture of total, committed aggression, hackles raised in a ridge down his spine, jaws locked around the guard's forearm and worrying it side to side the way a dog does when it has fully lost the thread of what it's actually supposed to be doing. 2 other figures stood back near the house's side entrance, a woman in a bathrobe who Eli would later learn was Whitfield's wife, screaming into a phone, and an older man in pajama pants and an untucked polo shirt, presumably Whitfield himself, frozen at the doorway, clearly too afraid to approach his own dog. "Nobody move," Eli said, and his voice came out flat and commanding in a way that surprised even him, an old command voice from a life he thought he'd left behind. And everyone on that lawn, remarkably, obeyed him, including, for one crucial second, Bruno himself, whose ears flicked toward the new voice. Eli dropped Karma's leash. It was, later, the detail the security guard and Whitfield's wife would both independently describe to police as the strangest thing they'd ever seen, because a homeless man deliberately releasing his own dog into an active attack scene should have made things worse, should have added a second aggressive animal into an already dangerous situation. Instead, Karma moved directly toward Bruno, not at him, toward him, at an angle, low and controlled, no hackles, no growl, and inserted her own body between Bruno's jaws and the guard's arm with a physical directness that had clearly been trained into her a very long time ago, a maneuver Eli would later learn was a textbook redirect technique used by military and police K9 handlers to break a dog's fixation without a physical fight. Bruno released the guard's arm, startled, and rounded on Karma with a snarl, and for one terrible second Eli thought he was about to watch his dog get torn apart by an animal twice her size and heavier by 30 pounds. But Karma didn't fight him. She dropped immediately and completely onto her side in the grass, exposing her belly and throat in the single most vulnerable posture a dog can offer. And she made that sound, the low rolling sound Eli had learned to recognize, pitched now in a register he'd never heard before, somewhere between a whine and something almost like a song, and Bruno stopped. He stood over her, chest heaving, and then visibly the fight went out of him. His ears dropped. His tail, rigid a moment before, sank low between his legs. He sniffed at Karma's exposed throat, once, twice, and then, astonishingly, lay down beside her in the wet grass, his own sides heaving, and let out a long, shuddering whine that sounded, more than anything else, like relief. Eli walked forward slowly, hands visible, and knelt beside both dogs. "Hey," he said soft to Bruno now, the same voice he used on Karma during her worst nights. "Hey, it's over. Whatever you thought was happening, it's over now." Bruno's tail thumped once against the ground. Behind him, Marcus Whitfield had finally found the nerve to step off his own porch, staring at the scene in front of him, his own dog, docile as a puppy, lying beside a stranger's dog in the grass, while a homeless man in a field jacket crouched between them with his hands moving in slow, sure strokes along Bruno's neck. "Who," Whitfield said, his voice not fully steady, "who in God's name are you?" "Name's Eli Marsh," Eli said, not looking up from the dogs. "Your man's gonna need stitches, some. Audie should call an ambulance instead of just the police." It was Whitfield's wife who'd already done that, to her credit, and within minutes the flagstone path was full of flashing lights, a paramedic tending to the bitten guard's arm, 2 Tampa PD officers taking statements, and Marcus Whitfield standing in his own driveway at 10:40 at night, staring at a homeless veteran and his dog with an expression that had shifted, in the space of about 90 seconds, from fear to confusion to something that looked almost like recognition, though of what? He couldn't yet have said. "You did that," Whitfield said, gesturing at the 2 calm dogs, with a piece of string and standing there talking. "My trainers couldn't do that with a shock collar and a muzzle." "Your trainers were trying to fix a symptom," Eli said, finally standing, his knee cracking loud in the quiet. "Something's setting that dog off, and it ain't age and it ain't temperament. Something specific is happening in this house that scares him, and it's been happening regular enough he's stopped being able to tell the difference between the trigger and an actual threat. That's not a bad dog, Mr. Whitfield. That's a dog having what my dog has some nights. And she used to clear roadside bombs for the United States Marine Corps, so I know the difference between crazy and scared when I see it." Whitfield looked at Eli for a long moment, really looked at him, the way people rarely bothered to anymore, and then he looked down at Karma, who had risen and pressed herself against Eli's leg, watching Bruno with something that, in a human, you might have called sympathy. "Come inside," Whitfield said. "Both of you, please. I think we need to talk." Eli almost said no. Some old, tired part of him, the part that had learned over 11 weeks exactly how the world tended to treat men like him, expected this to be a trick, or at best a moment of rich man's guilt that would evaporate by morning. But Karma, standing at his side, was looking up at the house again with that same locked, alert focus she'd shown 11 days earlier from the sidewalk, and something in Eli's gut, the same instinct that used to tell him which wire to cut and which one to leave alone, told him this wasn't over, and that walking away now would mean never finding out why. "All right," Eli said, "but the dog stays with me. Both dogs, actually, if that's fine by you. I don't think Bruno ought to be alone right now." Whitfield, to his credit, didn't argue. Inside, over coffee, Eli drank slow and careful, aware of how strange it felt to be sitting at a marble kitchen island in a house worth more than every dollar he'd ever earned in his life. Whitfield explained what he could. Bruno's episodes, he said, had started roughly 3 months back. He described the trainers, the vet visits, the bite that had put a man in the emergency room. He mentioned, almost in passing, that the timing had roughly coincided with his CFO, Gerald Voss, beginning a series of late evening visits to review quarterly figures in the home office down the hall, visits Whitfield had found slightly odd at the time only because Voss had never before insisted on doing that work outside the office, but which he'd chalked up to the man's dedication. Karma's ears had come up sharp at the mention of the home office. "Can I see that room?" Eli asked. Whitfield led them down a hallway lined with black and white photographs of shipping yards and cargo vessels, into a wood-paneled office with a large mahogany desk and a wall safe half hidden behind a bookshelf, and the moment they crossed the threshold Karma's whole body went rigid, and she sat, square and immediate, in the exact alert posture Eli had seen from her on the sidewalk 11 days before, staring fixed at the base of the bookshelf. "She's found something," Eli said quietly. "She's telling you there's something here." "There's nothing here but a safe with some contracts in it," Whitfield said, though his voice had gone thinner. Voss has the combination, obviously. He needs access for the quarterly reviews. Mr. Whitfield, Eli said, watching his dog, who had not moved, whose focus had not wavered. In my old line of work, when a trained detection animal locks onto a location like that and won't break focus, you don't argue with the dog. You clear the area and you call it in. Whitfield stared at the safe for a long moment, and something crossed his face that looked, unmistakably, like the first cold edge of real fear. The specific fear of a man beginning to suspect that something he trusted without question might not deserve that trust after all. I think, he said slowly, you'd better tell me exactly what you used to do in the military, Mr. Marsh. Eli told him, 8 years, EOD, 2 deployments, the Purple Heart, the shrapnel still riding in his hip. He didn't dress it up and he didn't apologize for any of it, and something about the plain, unadorned way he delivered it seemed land harder with Whitfield than any amount of self-pity would have. And the dog. Her name's Karma, found her starving behind a dumpster 2 months back. Turns out she used to do explosive detection for a Marine EOD unit overseas before some contractor lost track of her paperwork and she ended up feral in an alley in Ybor City. She's not crazy, Mr. Whitfield, and neither is Bruno. Something in this house is giving off a signature that reads, to a trained detection dog like danger. I don't know yet what that signature is. But I'd bet my last dollar, which is roughly all the dollars I got, that it's connected to whatever your Mr. Voss has been doing in this office at 10 o'clock at night. Whitfield sat down heavily in the leather chair behind his desk, and for a long moment he said nothing at all, staring at the safe half hidden behind the bookshelf, at the calm, alert dog sitting square in front of it, at the homeless veteran standing in his office with a steadiness that no amount of money had ever quite managed to buy him for himself. What do you need, Whitfield finally said, to find out for certain? Time, Eli said, and your permission to look, and probably somebody who still owes me a favor from my old life, who might know how to pull financial records the right way so nothing gets destroyed before it can be handed to police. What followed over the next 9 days was, in its way, the most alive Eli had felt since before his hip took shrapnel outside Kandahar. Whitfield gave him a guest room over the garage, which Eli initially refused on principle before accepting on the practical grounds that Karma needed somewhere warm and dry to recover her strength, and gave him access, cautious at first and then total, to every financial record Gulfline Transit had generated over the past 3 years. Eli wasn't an accountant, but 8 years of EOD work teaches a man to read patterns other people miss, to notice the one wire that's a slightly different color than it should be, the one connection that doesn't quite belong, and with help from Ray's, who put him in touch with a retired Army CID investigator now doing private forensic accounting work, Eli began to find the thread. Gerald Voss had spent 4 years quietly routing a portion of Gulfline's fuel and maintenance contracts through a shell logistics company he half-owned under his brother-in-law's name, skimming margin on every transaction, a slow bleed that had grown, over time, into a hemorrhage worth an estimated $3.4 million. The late-night visits to the home office weren't quarterly reviews at all. They were Voss accessing Whitfield's personal safe, where Whitfield kept backup drives of the company's older, unaudited financial records, quietly altering and replacing files to keep the discrepancy buried before the annual outside audit scheduled for February. And Bruno's episodes and Karma's alerts made a strange kind of sense once Eli understood what Voss had actually been doing in that office late at night. Voss, it turned out, had been storing something else in that safe alongside the altered records, something Eli only confirmed on the 7th night of his investigation, after he convinced Whitfield to let him and Karma into the office alone after midnight, when Voss believed the house was empty, having tracked, through phone records the CID investigator helped pull, that Voss made his visits specifically on nights Whitfield's wife's book club met and the housekeeper had gone home. Karma alerted, hard and immediate, the second Eli opened the safe himself with the combination Whitfield provided, sitting square in front of a false-bottomed panel at the rear of the safe that Whitfield himself hadn't known existed. Inside it, wrapped in a shop rag, was a compact block of what turned out to be a commercial-grade explosive compound, the kind used legally in certain demolition and mining contexts but tightly regulated, along with a detonator and a burner phone, all of it, the police would later determine, staged there by Voss as a contingency, a piece of insurance he'd apparently intended to use to destroy the safe's contents entirely, records and all, in the event his embezzlement was ever discovered. Framing it as an accident or an unrelated crime, rather than let a full financial audit expose 4 years of theft. There it is, Eli said quietly, staring at the compound with the flat, professional calm of a man who had diffused hundreds of devices far more dangerous than this one, while beside him Karma sat perfectly still, tail sweeping once against the carpet, finally, fully at rest. That's what she's been smelling this whole time, Eli said. That's what set Bruno off every time Voss came near this room. Dogs don't lie about explosive signatures, Mr. Whitfield. People do. Dogs just tell you what's true. The confrontation, when it came, happened 3 nights later, and it happened the way Eli had planned it with the CID investigator. And eventually, with a detective from the Tampa Police Department's Financial Crimes Unit, who'd been read into the situation, once the explosive compound made this considerably more than an embezzlement case. They let Voss come one more time, wired the house's security system to record clean footage of him accessing the safe, and had 2 plainclothes officers positioned inside the property with Whitfield's reluctant cooperation. Eli hadn't planned on being in the room when it happened, but when Voss arrived that Thursday night and let himself in with the door code Whitfield's wife thought only she and Whitfield knew, and made his way down the hallway toward the office, he found not an empty room but Eli Marsh sitting calmly behind the desk, Karma lying at his feet, ears up, watching Voss with a stillness that made the man freeze in the doorway. "Evening," Eli said. Voss's hand moved fast toward his jacket pocket, and Eli was up and around the desk before the man's fingers had even closed on what turned out to be the burner phone he'd apparently intended to use as a trigger, a movement so fast and so controlled that Voss never fully registered what had happened until he was face down on the office carpet with his arm locked behind his back at an angle that hurt considerably without doing any lasting damage, an old, practiced restraint technique from a life Eli hadn't used in years, but had never once forgotten muscle memory, lasting even the memory of why it mattered. Karma had moved at the same instant, not toward Voss with aggression, but toward the doorway, blocking it, a calm, immovable wall of muscle that made clear, without a single growl, that there would be no running from this room tonight. Plainclothes officers came in seconds later, and the whole thing was, in the end, remarkably undramatic, exactly the way Eli would have wanted a real operation to end. Controlled, quiet, nobody hurt beyond a wrist that would ache for a few days, a man in handcuffs stammering denials that nobody in that room believed, and a homeless veteran standing calm in the middle of it all with his dog pressed against his leg, both of them finally, after so long, on the right side of something that made sense. Gerald Voss was arrested that night on charges that would eventually include grand theft, wire fraud, and illegal possession of explosive materials, charges serious enough that even his lawyers, in the weeks that followed, quietly began floating plea negotiations rather than risk a trial. Gulfline Transit's board, informed of the full scope of the embezzlement, launched an independent audit that confirmed the CID investigators' numbers almost to the dollar. Marcus Whitfield, humbled in a way that his considerable wealth had never quite managed to humble him before, gave a statement to police that made a point, more than once, of crediting a homeless veteran and a rescued military working dog with uncovering what his own security firm, his own board, and his own instincts had missed for 4 straight years. The story made the local news within a week, and then, as these things sometimes do, it made the national news within 2, a headline about a millionaire's guard dog and a homeless hero that flattened a great deal of the nuance Eli would have preferred stayed intact, though he found, to his own mild surprise, that he didn't much mind the attention if it meant people finally understood what dogs like Karma had actually done for their country, and how badly some of them had been failed afterward. Whitfield offered Eli money, a great deal of it actually, an initial figure that would have let Eli buy a house outright and never work another day in his life if he chose not to. Eli turned down the first number, and the second not out of pride exactly, though there was some of that in it too, but because something in him understood, with the same clarity he'd once used to read a wire diagram, that money wasn't actually the thing he needed most. "I don't want to check, Mr. Whitfield," he told him, the 2 of them sitting on the back porch overlooking the bay a week after the arrest, both dogs sprawled in the winter sun between them, Bruno's head resting, astonishingly, across Karma's back. "I want my VA claim looked at by somebody who isn't trying to save the government money. I want help finding Karma's discharge paperwork so she's officially retired instead of just missing. And if you've got room in that logistics company of yours for a man who's good at finding the thing that doesn't belong, I could use steady work. That's it. That's the whole list." Whitfield, who had built an entire company on the principle of moving valuable things safely from one place to another, looked at Eli for a long moment and then laughed, a real laugh, the first one Eli had heard from him since that first terrible night. "That," Whitfield said, "I can actually do." It took another 6 weeks, but Whitfield was as good as his word, and some. He hired a veterans advocacy attorney out of his own pocket who got Eli's disability rating reassessed properly, restoring it not just to 60%, but once the full record of his original injury was finally reconciled by someone actually willing to look at both incident reports side by side, to 80%. Enough for a housing voucher and a monthly benefit that let Eli sign a lease on a small one-bedroom apartment in Seminole Heights with a fenced yard just large enough for a dog who'd spent too much of her life without one. Raised through channels Eli never fully understood and didn't ask too many questions about, managed to get Karma's discharge paperwork formally processed and backdated, an official retirement from federal working dog service that came with a small pension of her own, paid out through a veteran's animal welfare fund, enough to cover her vet bills for the rest of her life. And Whitfield gave Eli a job, real work, security consulting for Gulfline's shipping operations, using the exact skills the Marine Corps had once trained into him and the VA had once decided weren't worth 60% of anything. Bruno, it turned out, calmed almost entirely once Voss was gone and the compound removed from the house, though Whitfield, in a decision his wife fully supported, arranged for the big dog to spend one weekend a month at Eli's place in Seminole Heights, a standing playdate that both dogs seemed, in their own undemonstrative way, to look forward to. On a mild evening in early March, Eli sat on the back steps of his own small rented house, a place with his name on the lease and his boots by the door and a photograph of his old unit, finally hung on a real wall instead of tucked inside a plastic tote, and watched Karma lie in the last of the sun with her chin resting on his boot, that low rolling sound coming from her throat, pitched exactly the way it had sounded that very first cold night he'd learned to tell her good sounds from her bad ones. This one was good, he knew that now the way he knew the weather in his own hip. "We did all right," he told her, quiet, the words meant mostly for himself. "Took the both of us a long road to get here, but we did all right." Karma's tail thumped twice against the wooden step, and somewhere above them a plane came in low toward Tampa International, and for the first time in longer than he could remember, Eli didn't count the seconds until it passed. If this story moved you even a little, that's exactly why we make them, and we'd be grateful if you'd take a second to hit like and subscribe so more stories like Eli and Karma's can find the people who need to hear them. Drop a comment and tell us what part stayed with you most, whether it was the alley, the safe, or that quiet last scene on the back steps, because we read every single one. And if you know someone who loves a good redemption story, or someone who served and could use a reminder that their story isn't over, go ahead and share this with them. We'll see you in the next one.